All right, and as a reminder for everybody, just a little bit of general housekeeping. This session is recorded and the recording will be shared amongst participants. It will be on our YouTube channel. I will put a link to that in the chat. And if you have any questions as we go throughout the presentation, please feel free to utilize the chat, put your questions in there. It will be monitored by our presenters, and we will also have a Q&A at the end of today's session. And with that, Jan, Bill, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. There are probably a good number of you who joined since we asked the first time. If you wouldn't mind just putting into the chat whether you've attended any of the other days or if this is your first day, if you just put that in the chat, that would help us know how much time we need to spend going over that CMMC 2.0 requirements for you. If you've already heard it from us a couple of times, we'll sort of fly through them. If you don't mind adding that to the chat box, that would be very helpful. So this is what we're going to be talking about today as we tie this up, and really do appreciate the first couple of people we saw that put it in the chat. A lot of you, this is the third day that you've been here, so that's wonderful. But we are going to do that, try to determine how quick we do our review, the requirements, where we are on CMMC 0.2. But really the focus of today is to talk through manufacturing items. So where is CUI? Where do you find it? What is it when it comes into a manufacturing? It's really, as you all know, because you are in manufacturing, some of you, there are specific requirements and you a specific way as a manufacturing company. And some of these things may be a little bit eye-opening to you as what it expands to cover. A reiteration that these rules will apply to all tiers of the supply chain. So it doesn't matter if you're a real little micro business or you are a huge, big defense contractor like Northrop Grumman. It applies. And all the tiers, there's 1, 2, 3. We'll briefly talk about those again today, just to make sure everybody's clear. We will then, as 3 comply, Bill and I will be sharing some of our field experiences, and then we're happy to present our partner today. Rich Astley is here from NeQter Labs, and he's a partner of ours. He has several hundred clients in the DIB, and he will show you a little bit about what a tool can do. But really what he's talking through are the pitfalls and the things that he's seen in the field. We're really trying to help share that today. So that's what we'll be doing today. The first item is really this recap. It's not all about technology. It's people and processes too. So this is not something you just turn to your IT person, whoever, your director, your CIO, if you're big enough for that, or your security team, and just say, got this, it's all under control, right? It's not. There's people and processes. There's a calculation been made that 43% of these controls are about technology. And quick math, that's 57%. That's people and processes as well. So it's also that you just can't write that check and make it go away. There's actual work here that's involved. We do have a list that, if you it was up on the screen very quickly, but we'll show you at the end. We have a QR code. We have a list of free training. Free. Everybody likes free. There's free stuff out there from CISA. There's free stuff, of course, from the Department of Defense, like this. So there's a lot of information that is out here, but it can be a bit overwhelming. So our objective, our motto is comply simply. So we try to boil it down for everyone, and that's hopefully people who've attended for the last couple of days can give us feedback on that, but we tried to boil this down. And there is advice about 4 things you should do no matter what today when you finish this. If you've not enabled multi-factor authentication, MFA, you should do that right away. You should use strong passwords, and please look at your administrative passwords. There's a stunning statistic about how many of the hackers have gotten in by administrative passwords not having been changed in years. It's something people don't necessarily think about, but it is something. And the other thing is to make sure people know how to recognize and report phishing. And if you've been avoiding that update in your software, which happens very frequently in manufacturing, you don't want to, fool around with anything that might mess up your all your production procedures or how things are flowing or whatever in your software. Know that that is where the vulnerabilities may be lying. That you haven't updated your software. So that's when you need to consult with IT. They need to help do that, or close it off. Completely close it off. I was in a pharmaceutical company one time that had these big old fashioned computers, and they were all covered and pasted together with coverings of, I don't know, something like masked material. And that people walking around, of course, had goggles on and white gloves and the whole 9 yards. Those were cut off from their network and just ran in that room, those computers, because they were the ones that were running the product lines, and they were the ones that they had to depend on. So that's an option. You can cut them off, but you need to look at that. So that is what we're doing today. Brief, because I think most of you have said, Bill, have most people said that they have attended?
Yes, most people have attended all 3 days.
Okay, great. That's wonderful. Thank you for that. So I'll just kind of briefly remind you that we are at CMMC 2.0. They're still using the term 2.0. That is what the proposed rules in 32 CFR Part 170 are about 2.0. Again, just reiterating that it applies to any size and complexity of the company, but it also applies whether you're number 2 in a supply chain, 42, 102. It goes all the way down that supply chain. And just a quick reminder that it is under the rules, it is the prime that will decide what level of CMMC is required, whether you level 1 or a level 2. If you're a level 3, that's a whole different ballgame, and you would know that coming down the pike. You would have known that you have that level of information that you need to be at a CMMC level 3. There's an estimate that it'll only be about 1,500 companies in the entire 220,000 member DIB, which you'll hear from Rich. We all believe that's probably a low number of 220,000 companies in the DIB. It's designed, again, to protect the information provided by the DoD that is controlled and classified information. So we're still talking about self-assessments, which you've had since they went into full effect December of 2017, but the rule around that actually has been in place since 2013. So it's not something that you should not have heard about, that the NIST 800-171 rules or controls rather, were required. CMMC is that validation program. It's not the actual controls. So this is a listing here. Self-assessments are still a major component, but now they're saying you have to provide evidence. You have to report that every control was actually evaluated and is operating as it's supposed to. You need that senior level affirmation. Sorry for anybody that was depending on sales before. They're not going to accept that unless the CEO is a salesperson. And then levels 2 and 3, there are independent certifications every 3 years. And then there are self-assessments in between or annually. So these self-assessments are a big deal. And yes, my computer's not happy this morning. It doesn't seem to want to work. There we go. This is the current situation. I think I might have gone biased. No, I didn't. Okay. This is the current situation. We are, from CISA's perspective, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And Bill and I've met with CISA, and we've been informed that that's how you pronounce it. Not CISA, like we thought, but CISA. So if you want to be right and sound impressive, make sure you call it CISA. But we are in a shields up situation. That means everyone in the country is supposed to be ready to prepare for, respond to, and mitigate the impact of cyber attacks. And one of the requirements that we're talking about here and how to fulfill them, if you look at the requirement that came through from procurement for the Department of Defense since 2017, that's that 7012, for those of you who recall, it has 2 parts to it, actually. It does require NIST 800-171 controls, but it also requires that you have an incident response capability. And what we talk about is that the easiest way to fulfill that is to have an incident response plan. And what you'll hear if you look at, say, the SEC rules, or even something like the specific financial rules in the state of New York, DFSA, those are all about incident response. You have to have an incident response plan. You have to have that capability. So that's something that doesn't get talked about as often, but I wanted to make sure we talked about it today. You do need to have an incident response capability. And our experience, the best way to do is write that down and have a plan. One of the things we were asked to talk about was whether or not the DPA Title III had any specific requirements around cybersecurity. So when I was looking into that, I could not find a requirement for a cybersecurity program per se. Is it in conflict then with the requirements of CMMC? Yeah, maybe, because CMMC is costly to put in place if no progress has been made. But the DFR required, as we've said, it's been in place since 2017. So if you are availing yourselves of the Defense Production Act, which is not much left to avail yourselves of, but if you have in the past, you are going to be responsible for all these same CMMC requirements, just like academic institutions that have grants. Those are surprising to some academic institutions. Wait a minute, we have to do CMMC too? Yes, you do. You're getting money from the Department of Defense or any of its, agencies. And one of the things is how you would have expensed it if you had money. You could have expensed it and put it in place if you had something through the Defense Production Act. But they don't have a specific requirement on the documentation. And you'll hear from Bill and me both that one of the things that we find, or I would say the primary thing that we find, is that people don't really have adequate documentation. We don't think that it would be waived either for you if you are doing something under DPA, because the urgency around the pandemic has passed, but the urgency around cyber attacks has just been skyrocketing. So that's kind of a quick overview of the DPA, which we've been asked to tell you about. Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you for this slide to go over our ubiquitous roadmap real quick for everybody.
Sure. And I just put a question out to the audience in the chat. Just a question: have you guys had the opportunity to take a look at the actual documentation for either CMMC, D4s, or 800-171? If you happen to just put that in the chat window, a yes or no, or a Y or an N, that's just interested. So this is the road to CMMC. We went through this in detail yesterday. But bottom line, this lays out some of the basic high-level steps about how an organization would go through the whole process. And obviously, there's a lot more to this, right? But this basically provides some of the first thing. You start off with SPURS. You then be able to define your boundary and your enclave and your assets. You're then putting policies and procedures and plans in place. You're then you're doing your implementation, which is the longest, what they call it, the longest, I forget the phrase, but bottom line, it takes the longest of the whole process, right? Going through and putting the detail. The pre-assessment is what you're doing to set yourself up for that certification and making sure that things are checked. And going through the last portion is obviously going through the certification process. And from the audience, we have a mix of roughly about half and half of yes and no's. That's okay. And also the documentation that's out there, it's not exactly easy to read. So, but taking a look at it is not a bad idea. So some of the manufacturing cybersecurity statistics. So there's a lot of things that are out there, right? Because most manufacturers are usually, especially if you've been in business for a while, you have a mix of older technologies, newer technologies, all mixed into one. And some of those are, from design, they've worked for the past 50 years and they're not going to stop. Some of those are things that definitely are computer controls associated with them. Some of those things are not managed. Some of those, they don't have personnel. There's definitely risk that can come from that. So one of the again, this has been their big focus, is focusing on the manufacturers, because there is that mix of technologies that are using in there. And there are some smart ways to be able to manage this. Next slide.
Well, I just want to comment that one of the other things that is an interesting statistic, not only for manufacturing, but this lends to it, is that hackers in the know, which is the underground stuff and really the adversary nations, know to look for a senior leadership, senior person, and try to hack through their emails because they have more access than they probably should. And they have more access than most anybody in the company, and they don't really, the training doesn't stick. They don't really pay attention to it, and they know that. So that's why an awful lot of the hacking that you see goes through phishing emails that come to senior leadership who just click on it and there you go. So again, just in case somebody's looking at that going, OT, that's operational technology, that piece. So that's what that's talking about. And IoT is Internet of Things. And they are specifically addressed in the next, in the proposed regulations, especially OT was actually specifically addressed. So I'll go over this one, Bill. This is the state of where we are in manufacturing. It was from this company, Biotech. It seemed like it was kind of interesting as a graphic to take a look at it. The company is based in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So I think it's, but it is global, I should say. So the interesting thing is, again, OT spending will probably double. This is from 2023. So this is just last year. 73%, we had that unmanaged, and those are from two different sources, by the way. First source was from Forbes. There's insufficient expertise. This is a problem for everyone. It's not even small businesses, not business, it's the government as well. There just is not sufficient cyber expertise out available. I keep telling my nephew this is what he should go into, but he's not paying attention. He's 25. Only 24% of manufacturing firms have completed their operational technology security projects. They're costly. That's what we're talking about. It's a big lift if you've not really thought about it in terms of what the dangers are and the risks are to your organization. I hope that's one of the things that you'll be able to take away from the 3 days that we've been talking about it. It's not just ethereal, theory out there in the sky. This is real stuff. 61% of the intrusions last year were through the OT system or impacted the OT systems. And the IoT traffic in manufacturing is now the total of any industry, 56.8%. So that's really changed. And there's other statistics about how many people will be driving electronic cars. And of course, the new executive order that just came out this week from the White House will exponentially increase that as well. So these are really the best practices over there to the right. So I'm not going to read through them all. You probably have already looked at them anyway, but these are just ways to track what you're doing and what are the compromises that you've had to get to a resolution. There are exceptions. There are definitely exceptions. And there are things that just cannot be mitigated, and you have to write those down. I said there was something in the rules. There is. I'm going backwards on purpose because it highlights right here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but number 6, OT has been refined to having to be documented in the system security plan. That was a bone that the DoD threw in. I'm not sure how many of you will applaud that, but that's a bone they threw in. It's not going to be assessed separately, which will also decrease the amount of time, hopefully, that the assessors have to spend. So as long as you've got it appropriately documented in your system security plan, then you should be okay on operational technology. The CMMC flow down is just, all this kind of stuff we've already talked about, but don't forget, this is not just COI. There's FCI, and if you want to make sure you're in compliance, you've got to be looking at both pieces. Like I said a little bit earlier, it's the prime under the new rules. It's the prime that's going to determine the level of CMMC. And my experience with the primes, they need to get a whole lot better about that. They need to actually think about what it is that they're asking a prime to do. Bill's told his story. If you've been here, you know the story of the fact that that little small company making one small piece got the plans for a whole fighter jet, and boom, there it got stolen, and now China has it too. Yay! Today, there's no reciprocity for foreign and prime subcontractors to their own country's rules. Like, for example, Canada has already put in place a very similar program to CMMC, but today, Department of Defense is not accepting that. That's true out of a lot of European countries doing the same. And then everybody uses an external service provider, an ESP, shortcut to an MSP, or just we call them service providers, but they're proposed to attain the same or higher CMMC level as its client. So if you're a CMMC level 2, that means you have to be using an external service provider that's a level 2. That was one of those spanners, as the British say. That was an unexpected thing in the new rules that they were going to put in that requirement. It's dicey. It'll probably change in the finals, but who knows? To quickly, again, this is just what CFR Part 170. That is the part that made this an official program of the DoD, not just a procurement requirement. If any of you are still in the audience who were doubters that the Department of Defense would ever get their act together and get this to work, that's a real way of telling you, no, we made it a program. And they had told all of us in the industry a long time ago, like probably almost 2 years ago, that by them trying to go for or insisting, let's put it that way, on going to be a program, not just a procurement requirement, it would take longer. They were right. It did take longer. The amendments to 48 CFR Part 2, that's the DFARS, or the Defense Federal Acquisition Rules supplements. They are, they're supposed to be out this month. Okay, what's today? The 21st. We still haven't seen them yet. They don't have too much time left. We'll see. The other bone for small and medium businesses, SMBs, was this rollout of 2.5 to 3 years. I guess they were contemplating making it even shorter than that, but this is a relatively short period for final rules to be implemented, actually. Most of them are around 5 years, so it's not that big a bone, but they're trying. And then those are quotes right out of the 32 CFR Part 170 there. And if you have a question, which I believe we have that question, it is not absolutely required to be in a contract until October 1st, 2026. But there is a lot of discretion and a lot of flexibility for a project manager, which is what they actually state. A project manager could be a contract manager or procurement officer, just depends what they're called in the various agencies. But there's a lot of discretion about including CMMC requirements before that. And in fact, almost all of our clients have got a CMMC requirement already, and it's not even in effect yet. So they tried, but you would argue that they didn't do very well. So these are some observations from the field. I couldn't resist putting this slide in there. I'll cover level 1, and Bill will cover all level 2. So you've seen this yesterday. You saw this as well. If you think level 1 is much easier to achieve, you're right. There are only 15 practices. Technically, they're being called practices. 15 practices that these match up to FAR, and that's FAR 52.204-201, I think it is. We were supposed to have all that memorized, but I've lost track of all of them. There's too many now. But anyway, if you want to look up the FAR stuff, we can certainly give it to you. But these match up. Level 1 now matches up to FAR. If you've looked at and had, some of you certainly have said you did, if you looked at the old guidelines that were published in November 2021 versus these new guidelines from November 2023, the whole numbering system, everything is now different in level 1 than it was when we had the guidelines from 2021. There's new numbers, new stuff. Though all the B's, I'm just talking to you if you've seen it, all the B's actually refer directly back to that subsection in FAR, which outlines these 15 requirements. When I first looked at them, I was taken aback, like, oh, what the heck is this? There are some people who have conjectured, just underline that word, conjectured, that if you have FCI and CUI, they're going to require 2 different assessments. Don't panic. Don't panic yet. That's just was, you know, extrapolation of what they're seeing. These are, of course, from lawyers. So, you know, who knows? It does not explicitly say that in the law at this point. But it is quite different than what people have done in the past. So you can't take it very lightly. You can't take it informally. You have to actually go through all the objectives from NIST 800-171A, which is the assessment part, for the security requirement that maps to your CMMC level 1 security requirement, i.e. they've now added in all those objectives. This one of the lawyers, and I don't say it was Robert Metzger because I don't actually remember what lawyer was conjecturing about doing separate assessments, but he said, he's very well known in this space. He said it is, in orange there, it is doubtful that these demands are presently recognized by even a small fraction of companies that have FCI and are subject to level 1. Very, very doubtful. You'd actually have to read this to see. And this is just a picture, not for you to have to read. This is just a picture for example of what is in the level 1 guidance for assessment. There's a whole procedure. You got to have the objectives. I mean, you have to do all this stuff. And people have definitely not been doing that before. They definitely have not. So, Bill, do you want to talk about how to make this, or what the decisions are, remembering that it's time that will determine it, or it's already a contract requirement?
Yeah, sure. So the bottom line is that a lot of this stuff should come through the contract, or should be a notification. There are things that are actually marked CUI. There are things that are not. There's about 20 categories that are out there in general. The government has not done a great job at marking CUI to date. They told us though, is that if you ever are in question, treat it as CUI. So the bottom line is that you have to try to protect it if you can. You can try to get clarification. Sometimes they're good about it, sometimes not. Next slide. There is, and again, this is the requirements burger. We went through this yesterday. So there's definitely all these things out there in terms of the different CMMC levels. There's NIST 800, 171, 170A, and then on the side you have NIST 800, 172, and 172A. And there is that let's call it the plate that they consider the basis, the foundation that everybody's supposed to do these Appendix E NFO controls. That is not a CMMC thing. That is a DFARS thing. So in essence, you could be CMMC compliant, and if you don't do those controls, the DoD can come in and find you insufficient protections because you don't put those NFO controls in place. Next slide.
Well, I just want to comment. I apologize to all of you. Saw the slide yesterday that we had the French fries and the soda in there, and that was for level 3. And I forgot to put them in, so apologize to all of you. And just to point out that 853 is there because they're 800, 171, whatever, or 172 derived from 853. So if you ever want to know how this all came about, it's an interesting historic thing, but that's where that came from.
And these are just things from yesterday. Definitely there's public information, federal contract information, and CUI is a part of that. Next slide. And we went through this yesterday. There's smart approaches that are out there. There's the ideas of enclaves, and then you have to be able to implement against all of the assets within your environment. Next slide.
Well, I just want to also comment here that this kind of iterates for you or makes you understand that this is the implementation part that is making it kind of the most difficult. So that's why Bill has that example there. If you don't have an enclave, you might have identified those 25 assets, but in an enclave, you might limit it to the 10. And you can see there's a big difference there between the two, 4275 and the 1710. So I just want to point that out. There are some specific manufacturing considerations. I do want to emphasize, because a lot of people have asked, what's in it for me? I'm doing this. Of course, you're going to get your contracts. It enables you to bid, enables you to maintain your current contracts, but it's your intellectual property or your proprietary information that's being stolen. So this is a pretty major point that you should be, if you're in a position to talk with your executives, you should remind them, if you are an executive, this is what's going on. So Bill, back over to you.
And then we're just trying to, there's still a lot to go through. Manufacturing equipment is definitely something to take into consideration. These are things that you might not think about, but if you take a USB drive or you take a file and you put it into another device to generate a CNC machine, a milling machine, a 3D printer, could be any number of things. That is an extension of where that CUI potentially could be or could reside. They consider those special assets. You need to be able to declare them. And so there's definitely, you have to think about it. It's not just your email and the computers in your office. It's your engineering equipment and your manufacturing equipment as well. And see, we went through this a little bit yesterday. There's controlled technical information. It's a part of CUI. What bottom line is that these things could be, it could be digital, it could be paper, and these are pieces of information. It could be parameters, could be requirements that you might put inside of your designs or the things that you're doing to manufacture or the quality that you're checking on the back end. It also could show up in manuals as well. So there's lots of different places where this could wind up residing. Next slide.
Well, I just want to comment also, it's CDI as well, controlled defense information. And if you take and follow the whole rabbit hole, you'll see there's a lot of internal military stuff about cover defense information. And you, the contractor, are supposed to know that those things are CUI because that's how it's defined in one of those categories. So can be a lot of information that you would need to know if your prime or your contractor doesn't tell you. So there's a lot to it, is the point. Bill, this is to look like a picture that you would like.
Yeah, so there are definitely physical spaces are definitely into consideration. They're going to be looking at, there are some rules that look at ingress and egress. In other words, are you monitoring your areas doing, video, or are you having locks, or you have electronic types of locks? It doesn't have to be electronic. It could be keys. But the bottom line is, are you controlling the physical space, and especially the physical space where the information resides? So what you don't want to do is leave the doors to the shop floor wide open after the shift is done, and there are no cameras and there's documents all over at every workstation. That would be a bad thing to do. So you want to make sure that how you are managing the physical space is extremely important. It also goes outside the building as well. And the bottom line is, don't alter CUI or CTI. We have interacted with people that thought it was a great idea to take a Sharpie and mark off things that said controlled unclassified, and that was going to get them out of trouble. And that's not true. So the only people that can declassify it is the government, right? A person cannot declassify it, and there's a lengthy process that's involved in doing it. And it comes from the owner of the information. So you as a business, and if you are in receipt of that, you have to treat the information the way that it's intended to be treated. And only the government could make a decision and to make sure that if they wanted to downgrade it or not.
And it's a little dicey because the government takes this position, but they also tell any supplier, well, if you think it should have been COI, then you treat it like COI. So, they're trying to bake the cake, eat the cake, get rid of the cake, all at the same time. And when you get to the bottom line about this, the best practices for cybersecurity are about risk management. You have to know where they are from an internal perspective, external, and things that you cannot see. You look for things that are similar to other companies in your industry or competitors that are around the state. Look and see what other people are doing. If you can, you have time, you should try to go to some of the statewide meetings or in your area meeting so you can talk with your other competitors. We're not encouraging, collusion. I'm just talking about what are they seeing, what are they doing, what is happening out there, because most of you hopefully have a risk management process already in place, even if it's in your head. It should be on at least a spreadsheet, but hopefully how you're managing risk and deciding about the risk. And there's a lot that you cannot see. Just don't forget about those. You want to make sure you can manage the risk, but as I just said earlier, you can have exceptions that can be made if a risk is tolerable. Now, an assessor might disagree with you, but they can't ding you for not having evaluated it. That would be the point on that. And one of the most important things that you learn about all this stuff from a risk management perspective is you have to monitor, you have to measure, and you have to report them. And that's not just for your own little grouping of people within IT, for example, but for the bigger picture and definitely for the executives, which may include, in some cases, a board. So this is all very important. This is what it boils down to. And I wanted to mention also that we've said this before, but you really can't have privacy without security. And today there are privacy laws popping up all over the place in the US. And if you are global and you do any import or export, about GDPR, which is the European standard. The fines that were so far in 2023, this was from an article in December, had been approximately 4 billion euros, which equates to $4.4 billion. The company with most of the fines, you might guess, is Meta. They've got a lot of fines, but you as a small company even do need to know what the PII or protected information is for GDPR. And of course, we do now have multiple states. There's a proposed federal. So you've got to figure out, what you have, what are your core areas of concern in terms of protecting information just in general. It doesn't necessarily have to be CUI or FCI, but PII. Or about HIPAA, which is PHI. There's all these acronyms. But the laws that are both in place and proposed are about as much about cyber preparedness as they are about privacy. And when you read through the laws, I was trying to remember, it's NYDFS, the New York Department of Financial Services. That law has been around since 2017. It's been around. It's a cybersecurity regulation, and all of these have the incident report. Bill, I put one example in that I just talked about, the good news, those with privacy requirements. Everybody has them. It vastly improves your security. Do you want to speak to the SOC 2 ISO 20001 issue?
Yeah, just that a lot of people, if there are companies that go, oh, I have some ISO stuff. Well, ISO 9001 has to do with quality. 27001 is not the same. It has pieces that you could use, but it's not the same. And the same thing with SOC 2. So it does not help you get 100% the way there. It may get you a portion of the way there, but it's not something that, oh, I got that and I'm good, and you walk away. No, it's not the same. And there's a lot of misinformation that's saying that it is, and it's not.
Or we recently improved not security, our security. Apologize for that. We've done lots of things to improve our security. We've heard quite a few, and I'm sure Rich will have more examples of this, but our questions are, oh yeah, is it documented? Do you approve of training, and does it actually work? There's lots of things like that, like Bill's example where the cameras, the video cameras, they had them, but they didn't work. So what good does that do? And no one was monitoring them. So yeah, or we use a big name. I have Microsoft, Google, etc. So I'm all set. You know, a lot of people think they're all set and they don't have the one that's for government work. You have to have the one that's for government work. Is it more expensive? Unfortunately, yes, but you're not really set if you're using the commercial platforms of any of these companies, you're not really set. And we've mentioned before, and Rich will go in a little bit more about customer responsibility matrix. Did you actually do it? Do you actually have it in place? And there are many, many more issues like this or items like this for any external service provider. So you can use a big name and still not be there. You can use a small name and you're definitely not there. So here is more from the ground level. Rich, you're going to be up here. So Rich Astley is a co-founder, and he's the president and CEO of NeQter Labs, and they're a partner with us. And I think you'll really get a lot out of his stuff. You just tell me to drive, and I'll drive, Rich.
All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for attending the third day of this great webinar. I think it's been really helpful, and hopefully I can kind of be a bookend to what 3Comply has offered you and leave you with some real field experiences from our perspective. Okay, next slide, please, Janet.
See, senor, let me make sure it's going to work here. Come on. Oh dear. It does get stubborn sometimes. I don't know why. Wait a minute. Here. You can still go on and you know what's next, and I'll get the slide.
So just introduction, I'm Richard Astle. I'm the CEO of NeQter Labs.
Here we go.
And NeQter Labs is a cybersecurity software company that is mainly focused on providing audit-ready compliance solutions to the small business market, mainly in the Department of Defense. So we're small business centric, we're compliance focused, and we've worked with probably thousands of companies, but we have hundreds of direct clients in the defense industrial base. So we're very well versed in the compliance arena. We've seen it all, we've heard it all, we've experienced it all. And so I think we're qualified to provide some feedback to you on things to avoid and things to look for. I don't want to make it all about NeQter, but I will tell you a little bit about us and where we came from. So in 2016, we started out actually under a defense contractor, a pretty large defense contractor in Rhode Island, who had a pretty large customer base, subs and primes. Well, they had a large vendor list, and we were designated as a innovation group, it was called, where we were tasked with figuring out how to help their supply chain meet NIST 800-171 at the time. And as you know, that's pretty much a direct correlation to what CMMC 2.0 is today. And we had probably, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 suppliers that we did a beta test with, where we basically kind of looked into what they had, what they didn't have, what their posture was. And we realized very quickly that, you know, most of them are the mom and pop shops, 1 to 2 person machine shops, all the way up to maybe like a 50 or 60 person, like a printed circuit board manufacturer. We had auto body shops that did some epoxy coating on components. We had documentation companies who were outsourced to do like CAD documents. We had it all. And so we looked at all of those companies and we realized very quickly that they were missing. So a lot of them are doing the fundamentals, right? They have a firewall in place. They have a password policy maybe where they change their password every 30 days or whatever. They may or may not have an IT person. Many of them don't have an IT person on staff. The vast majority of them were missing the fundamentals, or what we consider the fundamentals of compliance, and now what the government is actually designating as some of the fundamentals of compliance. And the four things that we saw that were missing were SIM, so security, information, event management. I'll go into each one of these a little bit. So security, information, event management is basically the government wants you to audit and account for all of the events happening on your network. So Janet had mentioned using an external service provider like Google or Microsoft. That's a prime example of something that people often miss. You need a connection to that. Every time you log on and perform an action in one of those environments, it creates a log. That security log is then stored for a certain period of time, whether in the cloud or supposed to be on a SIM tool, where you bring it down into a correlation engine essentially and look at that. So millions of these happen every day, literally millions of logs every day. And you can't really read them all. The government wants you to do audit, like log reduction, correlation, and then obviously management of those things and taking actions if something is amiss. For example, if you use Google G Suite, you may get an alert, or you may not get an alert that somebody tried to access your account from another location. Every time you access your account from a separate computer, it might say, hey, is this you? Well, every time that happens, that generates an event. If that happens in the middle of the night, you might not even know. So SIM tool collects all of that data from your cloud environments, your local PCs. So every time you log on or put a USB in or perform any action, download a software, access a file, all of those things create event logs that can build and paint a picture of things that could potentially be malicious. And so the government wants you to collect all of that data, store it in a central location for 90 days, alert on anomalies, and also be able to have that data in case of an incident to be able to present that to for an after action review. And so that was one thing that many of the clients were missing. And then the other thing was even basic inventory. So inventory of your assets. What is on your network? Do you even know? Do you have a list of all of the hardware and all of the software and all of the printers and all of those things, that cameras, phones, cell phones, iPads, what's on your network, and do you know what, and can you control it? You can't control what you don't know. So that was a big part of what we saw was missing. Janet had also mentioned fixing system flaws, essentially. So vulnerability scanning. How many of you are running, network vulnerability scans, on a monthly basis to know, is your software out of date? Does it need an update? Does it need a patch? Are there open ports that you need to be worried about? Are there any known threat vectors that you could mitigate easily? Many small businesses just aren't doing that. And we found that in our research. And then last but not least, the compliance is complicated. It's changing rapidly. And we found that very quickly that many people are trying to manage these controls on a spreadsheet. And that gets hard to do when you have, NIST 800-171, and then CMMC comes out. And now you got to, transfer your stuff into the CMMC language. And then CMMC 2.0 comes out, and you're like, now I got to move it again. And then now we're looking down the barrel of NIST Rev 3 and CMMC, the final rule. And so what we found there is that really they needed some other tool to manage their compliance, be able to convert and crosstalk between the compliances, and then also be able to attest to each control and each assessment objective, have guidance for each objective, be able to provide evidence for each objective, and then keep all of that in a single location under revision control, so that you can show maturity processes and maturity throughout. So what NeQter did was we built a tool that kind of encapsulated all that, and we did basically a beta program in 2016 and 2017, and then we've been a company ever since. And like I said, we worked with mainly manufacturers in the DoD space. So I think it was important to kind of go over what people were missing. But what I really want to talk about is what we hear every day. So we talk to hundreds and hundreds of companies all the time, and we're hear a lot of the same thing. And so what I wanted to do is list out what pitfalls you should avoid. So how this is going to work, basically the statement is the statement at the top, the thing we hear from clients, and then underneath is, you know, the explanation of why that may not be the case. So I'll go through these one by one. Small DoD contractors aren't a likely target. Well, that is definitely not the case. You know, our adversaries are smart. They know that a lot of these small manufacturers have more data than they need to produce the parts many times, and therefore it's easier to, you know, infiltrate a small company that does not have the high-tech security in place and get the same data that they could get potentially from going after a prime. I'll give you an example. We used to have a honeypot, we called, where we'd put it on our networks of, you know, our customers, and we just see, you know, almost like a sensor of what people are doing. And your firewall kind of does the same thing. So we actually did a local 911 center. And we looked at their firewall logs, and I was just going through some basics, and I said, hey, I want to show you how this works. We can see all the block traffic from China, you know, within 5 minutes of deploying our tool. And, you know, we're looking at that and going through and, you know, like filter out all of the China traffic from China. And within 5 minutes, we were seeing successful packets back and forth to and from China. So it's that you are a target even though you don't think you are. There's a lot of stuff happening that, you know, your firewall will block, or if you have good general security in place, you're protected from. But many times there are some loopholes that are easily exploited. Number two, I don't have that much CUI. So I hear this all the time when we talk to clients. Do I really have to implement all 110 controls? I don't have that much data. I only make a couple of brackets. Well, most of you know how the DoD works, and they, like Bill said, you have this company who got the whole plan for one of our jet fighters that was compromised. That's very common. You know, you might be making a component for a torpedo or whatever it may be, or something for the Air Force, a tank, a Humvee, whatever, and you're getting a bracket, but that bracket comes along with the parts list with a mapping to all of the other documentation, and sometimes it comes with a whole documentation package. Whether you have a one bracket with a part number on it or the whole package, if you have CUI, the compliance applies to you. So number three, your CUI arrives in hard copy, so you're exempt from the compliance. Well, no. You still have to address all of the compliance requirements. And also, I've yet to really see, unless you're kind of working very, I don't want to say in the Stone Age, but it's you know, not doing things as efficient as possible. It's very rare that you can just get a piece of paper mailed to you in the mail and then use that to do everything you need to do. If you have a CNC machine, that data is getting put into there. Unless you have a manual lathe and you're reading the documentation and that was delivered to you and doing one part at a time, which is not the case most of the time, maybe in very few cases, you probably are network connecting this data in some capacity. You're using it on a computer that's connected to the internet. If you do, all of the requirements apply. Next slide. Number four, you're covered if you store, and I'll add to this a little bit, or transmit unclassified information securely. So, you know, you have a special place where you store your a server that's encrypted. Great. You have an end-to-end encryption when sharing. Great. But what about the computers that access that data? Where is it going? Where did it come from? Do you have other suppliers that have that data? What happens when they unencrypt it to do stuff on their end? That whole chain is part of your scope. You have to flow down those requirements to those other suppliers. You have to make sure that wherever that is accessible in your network, that is part of your scope. And a lot of times we see, you know, I only access this from one email, and then I bring it down and put it on my file server. So I got it securely, I put it on my file server. Who has access to that file server? Are you monitoring access to that file server? Are you collecting logs from that file server? Are you updating those vulnerability signatures on that? Are you scanning for vulnerabilities on that file server and remediating them? Do you have physical security? You know, there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. It's not just storing it encrypted. So number five, a knowledgeable IT manager can address compliance. This one's a maybe. I see a lot of very knowledgeable IT managers who do a ton for compliance. I have not seen one that can do it all yet, because it takes a village. It's really a holistic approach to compliance where you need the whole company to have buy-in in many cases. Like we talked about, physical security, risk assessments, remediation plans, vulnerability scanning. It's not just one person. However, we see a lot of the higher ups in companies that will say, well, my IT guy has it, and they might be misinformed on what it entails, and then they also don't provide that IT person with the tools they need. So I put in here, a carpenter can build you a house probably, but probably not by himself, right? He probably needs a team, people to help him carry things. He needs the tools to build that house. He can't do it on his own. So yes, an IT person is great to have, and can probably do some of it for you, but they probably need a little help as well. Once compliant, always compliant. So I see a lot of companies, they'll answer the questions in a questionnaire as easy as fast as they can and say, oh, I'm good. I know I never have to look at this again. CMMC inherently is a maturity model. You have to show maturity. You have to practice what you preach. You have to update accordingly. You have to define how often you're updating your and checking and testing these requirements, and then making changes accordingly. If you don't do that, you probably won't pass an assessment, or you'll have trouble passing an assessment. If your on-premise computers are secure, you're compliant. Maybe this one's a maybe as well, but a lot of times people use mobile devices that have access to their network. They don't have a guest network, for example, for their Wi-Fi. Remote workers, with COVID, everybody went remote. That changed things. Really, that's part of your scope. If you have somebody using their home computer, I see this all the time, a home computer to access a cloud environment that has CUI in it for the company, or the home computer used a VPN into somebody's network, a network of our customer, and they don't have any of the security protocols on that home computer. Or even if you're accessing it from a work PC remotely, is that physical environment secure if they're accessing CUI? Do you have any protections to make sure that can't happen? They can't bring controlled unclassified information onto that computer. So those are all things you have to consider. It's not just your local environment per se. It's anywhere anything that has access to that local environment, including an external service provider. That was brought up earlier as well. Number 8, this is the fun one. My SPRS score is 110. So I'm sure you guys learned a little bit about SPRS scores in the previous days. So everybody that's a supplier needs to put a score in. It's out of 110, but it can go into the negative. There's a very specific scoring methodology. It's called the DODAM scoring methodology for building your score, and it takes into account you don't get any points, for example, if you don't do all of the sub requirements at the top, from the top level associated with that top level requirement or control. So many times we see companies say, just read the top level. Yeah, I'm doing that, or interpret it as if they're doing it, and then give themselves full points, give themselves a 110 score. Well, you're leaving yourself open and vulnerable to legal pitfalls down the road. That's a red flag. I'm sure Janet might be able to talk to this at some point, but the DOJ and the False Claims Act. So we see that companies that are putting 110 in there, the scores are going to be used to for contract award eventually. And if you have 110 and it's not really 110, you're kind of inflating your score, and therefore winning contracts, and that can open you up to legal ramifications down the road. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's pretty high. The fines for, it's like I think it's multiple times like the amount you won.
Yeah. It's there are individual claim by claims. That means every invoice that you submitted can be fined at, I think it's $27,000 per claim. And then if you're really knowingly and willfully, you knew it, somebody told you, this is where whistleblowers come in. I told you, and they don't do anything about it, then it can be tripled. So we're talking about a lot of money, a lot of money.
So I guess the takeaway here is, do not overinflate. It's okay to have not 110. right now. It's okay to have that. It's okay to have a plan of action and milestones with things that you plan to fix. That's okay. With CMMC, you're going to need to do everything, but for an assessment. But for the SPRS, don't overinflate. Work towards a better score. Guess that's the takeaway with this one. Number 9, it's a fun one as well. Cloud-based means compliant. Actually, Janet mentioned this and Bill mentioned this as well. Not necessarily. What we see a lot is people will say, we're going to the cloud. We're going to do everything in the cloud. Well, that's actually just an extension of your environment. Many times companies have a local network and then they use the cloud environment. Well, how are you accessing that cloud environment? Many times those PCs and those assets that access the cloud environment are in scope. They are accessing the data that might be considered CUI. So don't think or don't be fooled when somebody tells you, I'm just going to the cloud so you can forget all of the local, the requirements. They're going to be taken care of in the cloud. Not necessarily. And to further that a little bit, if you don't use the correct cloud platform, you're basically not going to be compliant at all because they don't meet the requirements, especially the DFARS 7012 requirements. So keep that in mind. Also with the CMMC final rule, they're expanding those considerations for external service providers that have to be compliant themselves. And if they're using cloud solutions, they may actually have to be FedRAMP. So that's yet to be finalized, but that seems like the way it's going. So a lot of the tools you may use that are in the cloud might not be compliant if they have CUI in them. So just something to keep in mind. Cloud, it can be great, don't get me wrong, and it's utilized by many companies. Almost all of our companies have a hybrid environment that we work with, but doing it right is important. And the last but not least is I use an external service provider, so I am all set. I see probably above 80% of our companies that we have use an external service provider, whether it's a cloud service provider, an MSP, a MSSP, IT service provider that's not internal to the company, that has access to their network. I would say that there's only a handful of external service providers that have their act together in terms of compliance, that have actually gone through the process of looking at compliance on their own, that have a shared responsibility matrix that they can share with their companies and can prove line by line which of the controls that they actually meet with evidence. If you can't get that from your external service provider, you might want to look at using a different one, or you might want to encourage them to make sure they can provide that to you in the near future, so that when assessment time does come and you're asked that by your assessor, that you actually can provide it as part of the evidence. External services can be a great way to kind of offload some of the heavy lifting for requirements, but they're still your responsibility to ensure that they meet the requirement. So make sure that you do your due diligence. So now that you know what we see, let's talk a little bit about where the defense industrial base actually is, and you probably will relate to this a little bit. So as Janet mentioned earlier, there's 220,000 companies that support the DoD directly. From our perspective, that's very low. We probably think it's double or triple that at least. That's probably only the second 2 or 3 levels down in the supply chain. But like I said, we were working with clients 6, 7, 8 layers deep in the supply chain, all the way down to an auto body shop who got drawings for an epoxy coating on a torpedo launcher. So it goes pretty deep. According to the DoD themselves, 73% of the defense industrial base is made up of small businesses, probably like many of the people on this call. And many of those companies, compliance and IT aren't their main focus. They're focused on building stuff and making stuff and providing product. And less than 20% of companies assessed by DIBCAC met all compliance requirements. So next slide, please. The Defense Contract Management Agency in 2022 released its findings for the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, which is DIBCAC. They assessed over 100 companies, and they found that less than 20% actually satisfied all the requirements. So that tells you, what the state of the DIB actually is. That was this kind of remember, if you think back to what I was saying at the beginning when we did our own assessment of 30 or 40 or so companies, and what we saw was missing, they found the same thing. And remember, the DIBCAC was actually assessing companies that were primes and subs that had more funding, typically, or have applied more effort to the compliance than most. So in the general defense industrial base, that number of 20% is probably lower. I'd say it's probably around 5 or 10%, to be honest, that are actually addressing all of their requirements. Where they fell short is interesting. So FIPS validated cryptography. Now, this one is up in the air right now as to whether or not that's going to make it as we go forward. But FIPS validated cryptography, so that means, you know, you're using a FIPS validated encryption protocol for your connection. So many firewalls use this, some don't. So you got to be very careful which firewall you use. That's just an example. I think Windows uses BitLocker, which is a FIPS validated module. So just keep in mind that when you're using cryptography, it has to be FIPS validated. Multi-factor authentication is a big one. That's an easy one to implement too. Relatively easy one to implement. It's hard to get a adoption from your employees many times, because they're like, I don't want to have to do two things to log into my computer. But it's a requirement. It's easy to implement. It does cost a little bit of money. There are free things out there. I think Duo, they may still have a free under 10 user multi-factor offering. At least they used to. So it's not too bad, but it can be done. But that's one that was missing. Identifying, reporting, and correcting system flaws. This goes back to the vulnerability scanning, people not understanding where system flaws are and then fixing them. Not having a risk assessment, not analyzing their risk, not understanding their risk, not scanning for those vulnerabilities like we had mentioned, not reviewing and updating those logs events that need to be collected in the SIM tool, because probably they don't have a SIM tool. Audit logging process failures. So if you don't have a SIM tool, and then that process isn't even in place most of the time. So you can't really alert in the event of an audit process failure. Incident response testing. So you might have a plan, but you haven't tested it out. It's pretty self-explanatory. And then baseline configuration, establishment, and maintenance. This one's tough. I think one of the chats, I think it was from Brent, said that, you know, I'm starting up a new company, and I'm starting from scratch. So it's that's a good way to do it. If you can do that, if you're, you know, starting a company and starting from scratch, it's easy to create baselines and then build off of those baselines. But if you're an established company who has 100 assets out there and they were all just procured at different times and they never had a baseline, that's a little tougher. So you need some sort of tool to help understand, you know, what software is on there, what hardware is on there. Do I have a whitelist or a blacklist of those that software that I don't want on there? Are there any computers or pieces of equipment that are on some, like, for example, Huawei with they were cameras. Those you can't use because they had a backdoor to China. So there's things you got to think about there. But baseline configuration is a big one. Many people aren't doing it, mainly because it's hard to do. So how are people meeting compliance? So let's first address the elephant in the room. Compliance stinks. It's hard. It can be expensive. It's hard to keep track of what you actually need because it seems like it changes with the wind. Really and truly, the requirements are the same, but the timeline has changed for CMMC quite a bit. But NIST is still a requirement, NIST 800-171, and that will be your jumping point for CMMC when it comes time for an assessment. And let's face it, you're all focused on making things because that's what you're good at and that's what keeps the lights on. So this is probably not a priority, but it needs to be. And so how are people doing it? How are people tackling this? It is achievable. We do see many people taking the DIY approach, which I think is a great approach to take for a few reasons. It keeps everything in-house. It limits your scope. It gives you a great understanding of compliance if you do your due diligence and understand the compliance in its entirety. You know, it can have a long-term cost savings because you're not, you know, working with a bunch of outside vendors and then switching them out, and, you know, company goes out of business or you don't like them anymore, they charge you too much. The more you can keep in-house, the more you have control over that. and kind of keep that cost down and that scope down. However, the risk is that I see many companies try to tackle it themselves without fully understanding. And when that happens, you're paying twice or three times, and you're going through different tools and different outside vendors and internal people that get burnt out because the things aren't controlled properly, and that can lead to overspending. So there's our benefits and there's also risks. So just some considerations. It can be beneficial if appropriately resourced and proper tools are procured. You do need tools. You do need to buy things to comply. There's not really a silver bullet. You can use open source tools, but those can be inherently hard to manage. There's different ways to do it, and it can be done. And we see this approach a lot, and I think it's a good one. Just be aware that you need to understand completely the compliance before you dive in. The second approach we see is hiring a consultant, which I think kind of pairs very well with the DIY approach. So consultants will generally come in with an unbiased look, take an unbiased look at what you're doing and give you good feedback and give you good pointers on, which way you should go. And the benefits of using a consultant are that you probably will end up with something that's properly implemented, completely thought out, and robust and probably long lasting. The risk is that many people that engage with consultants haven't considered the cost of a consultant necessarily and haven't built that into their plan. So they said, compliance is going to cost me $30,000 and that's it. However, on the flip side, it might cost you money, but it's probably how many man hours is your, IT person or somebody in your company putting into researching something that somebody else can tell you much faster how to do. So I do think hiring a consultant is very, very valid approach, especially when combined with the DIY approach. I think that's a good approach. We see maybe 20 or 30% of the clients we work with using a consultant. Lastly, I see this a lot, purchasing a managed solution. So enclaves, cloud environments, turnkey compliance offerings, they're all viable options if implemented properly, and that's a big if. There are very few turnkey solutions out there that will meet the compliance in its entirety, but there are some, and there are some that are affordable. And we could go into that we could go into that in another session. But they are out there. You just need to do your due diligence. The benefit of working with a managed solution is that you don't have to, a lot of times they'll just rip and replace. They'll say, this is what you need. It's standardized and it's going to meet the compliance. You have to pay for it, but it's going to achieve a lot of the things that you don't have in place right now. There are other ones that will work with what you already have and kind of fill in the pieces. And then there are service providers that just want to sell you a tool stack just because that's what they resell, and it might not be compliant, but they just say it's compliant and then get you to buy it, and then you kind of lulled into a false sense of compliance and you end up not being compliant in the end. So you got to be careful who you pick. I think some of the formatting got messed up on this slide, but it's important and to always make sure you get a shared responsibility matrix from your external service provider outlining, and this is very important, which controls are being covered by the provider with a mapping to each assessment objective. So not just the 110 controls, but each assessment objective within those controls. There's 300 and some odd assessment objectives that need to be met with CMMC in this. Make sure that you get it at that level, because if you don't, you're going to be asked for that level when you get assessed. So it needs to be provided at that level to be adequate. And I don't see many companies do that, but there are a few. And if your ESP or external service provider does not give you that, ask for it, demand it. Hopefully they can work on it and provide it to you, and then you'll be good. If not, you might want to find another one. So key takeaways: compliance can't happen overnight. Many people will say, well, it's not in my contract, I'll do it when it hits my contract. Well, it's a maturity model, like I mentioned earlier, and it takes time to mature. So it can't happen overnight. You can't pay for it overnight either. So start working on it now, start putting the pieces in place that are important and easy to do, and then start chipping away at the harder ones. That's how I would approach it. Avoid the common pitfalls that many organizations encounter. So those 10 things that I talked about earlier are things that we hear that are common misconceptions when people are trying to comply. Try to avoid those. Use the resources that are available to you. I'm preaching to the choir because you're all here today, and for the last 3 days, many of you using the resources that are available to you. There are many companies like my own, like 3Comply, or even like Apex, that you can reach out to and ask questions. You don't have to pay for it. Call and ask. We get questions all the time. How should I do this? How are other companies doing this? Many times companies will be happy to talk to you about that and give you some insight into how others in your same space are doing. Actually got that question last night. One of our clients said, how good am I compared to my other competitors? So it's common, and we'd be happy to help answer those questions for you. When using an external service provider, again, make sure you get that shared responsibility matrix. CMMC can be achievable and affordable if tackled properly. It can be a pitfall. It can be a money sink if you do it wrong 3 times. So be very diligent about what you choose in terms of tools, in terms of teammates, team members, external service providers, to make sure that you're not going through them and churning them, because that costs money to kickstart and restart everything. And then last but not least, and I want to leave you with this, there's no silver bullet for compliance. If somebody tells you they can do it overnight, run away. If somebody tells you it's only going to take, a couple of weeks and you can write the check, no. You ultimately have the responsibility for the compliance. I've yet to see a turnkey solution that covers everything, mainly because it can't. I don't know how a tool is going to cover your physical security and your locks on the door. It can't address that. It can't write to it. It can't prove it. So just keep in mind that there's no silver bullet. There are companies that will do much of it for you, and I'm not discrediting that, but just keep in mind there's no silver bullet. So I wanted to thank you guys today. We have a lot more we could talk about, but not enough time. So I just if you want to learn more, I put a QR code in here. You can just put your information in and shoot us some questions. We'd be glad to answer them, or just give us a call. And we'll answer anything you have. If we can't answer it, I'm sure one of our partners on this call will be able to answer it for you and point you in the right direction. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rich.
Rich,
I thought it was very helpful. I hope that those of you who are listening, our participants, thought it was also that we have reached that time where you can ask any question you'd like. I think Bill has been monitoring the chat while we've been talking. So are there anything that you want to discuss, Bill?
yes,
And anybody else, just ask your questions right now in the chat, or you can come on live.
if there's anybody that wants to ask a question live, please go ahead. You just go on mute, off mute. And then I'll follow up with some of the questions that came in, Rich, as you were talking. All right. Okay. Some devices that access the cloud with CUI are in scope, or all devices that access the cloud with CUI?
So I think the question is, I would say anything that accesses CUI is in scope. So if the question is, if you have a mechanism, so I've seen this before too. So there are mechanisms in place to kind of create rules that won't allow certain assets to access certain files and folders and things. And if you have that granularity and you're able to segment, you can probably make the case that it's not in scope. But if you just have a GCC high environment that all of your employees have access to, even though they shouldn't have that, might not want them to, or you might tell them not to, but the computer has access to it, I would say that those are in scope. If that answers the question.
Excuse me, Bill. I think I'm sorry, I'm coughing, so I go on mute. Sorry.
There's one person that's asked about the free resources. If you want to just, if for whatever reason, sometimes it's possible that after that free resources link comes in, it sometimes winds up in a spam folder. If you just send a direct message to comply@3Comply, I'll be happy to send that out.
It's here.
I saw Bill, there was one chat. What is the tool for companies under 10 to do multi-factor? It's Duo Security, Google Duo. I'm not 100% sure if they still have the free I think that NeQter is actually still a Duo reseller, so I could find that out for you. We don't do them that often anymore. It's something that we used to do in the past because people didn't have it. It's kind of evolved a little bit. But for under 10, I know that actually, because we're under 10 users at NeQter, we use Duo for free. So I'm guessing they still offer it.
I was going to
We
mention,
also had somebody, Brent, you wanted to ask a question out loud?
Yes.
there you go.
Go ahead.
Okay. So a big one was the provider that you would use, right? Like your cloud storage. Would blockchain be sufficient? Would I be like, what is, or is that just a fine line with the government as far as contracting
So you're saying a
and like
block
services being
use a
provided?
blockchain. So I don't know. So the only cloud providers that are like, so GCC High would be the one that we see most people use, and I think Amazon GovCloud now are really the only two.
No, Google also has
Google just, yeah, I think they just added it too.
they
We
have their
a
own,
very
yeah.
specific cloud environment. The reason I think blockchain wouldn't meet the requirement is because the FedRAMP requirements for or the 7012 requirements, the DFAR 7012 requirements, they require you to have a system backup, I believe. Like they need very specific access to the data for forensics, and with blockchain you couldn't get that because it's distributed. So I don't think that would work, but I couldn't answer that directly.
I
would
believe
say probably not.
I believe on AWS, I do believe they have a an application that you could use to be able to have transparency with organizations who may need the information.
Bill
So
would
I'm
know
just,
the answer
Yeah.
to that, I think.
There's, yeah, it's Brent, this is a very complicated topic, right? Because there's a lot of layers. It's like an
okay,
onion.
I'm sorry.
No, but it's
No,
okay.
good.
No,
Okay.
but I'm familiar with what you're talking about. So Amazon has a GovCloud, right? The thing is so they'll provide either a platform as a service or infrastructure as a service, and then
Yes.
you might build your application on top. The thing is, if that application is going to be handling CUI, that application itself, even though it's on a secure platform, needs to go through that FedRAMP requirement. And so that is a complicated topic. It takes a lot of time and energy and effort to get that. Not to say that it isn't worth it, but it's a huge investment. So if for a smaller environment, if you were going to be using a SaaS provider, you would want to try to use a SaaS product that's already FedRAMPed, or has some products out there that are just getting this FedRAMP equivalency. A FedRAMP, will lack on a better description, is basically it's executive agency sponsored. And so there are some people that are going out there for FedRAMP equivalency where they don't have that sponsorship.
Well, no, the Department of Defense bill just issued the memo on that, so it will be the sponsor, Department of Defense.
Okay.
As Bill said, it's a complicated topic.
It's a very complicated topic.
So if you want to have a discussion, just, write to comply at 3 comply, or Bill.Cameron at 3 comply. I think that's the next slide. Yeah, here. You can write to Bill directly. He's an AWS certified person, so he can help you definitely understand that. But it is complicated. And that's a message everybody should take away, especially if you are listening in or hearing this as your designated person from your company and you have seniors to report into. It's not a small undertaking. It's not something that is a silver bullet. It's no get out of jail free, all the little acronyms and things we've said in the last 2 days. But it is something that, as Rich said, you can do it and make it affordable. It's just complicated to get the plan in place. And that was when I was coughing before, apologies. What I was trying to say was the reason that we often start with our clients on understanding where that COI flows is for just that reason of assigning or establishing rather a scope and a boundary. That is why we do it. What we were discussing earlier about, is it just the ones that in the storage question, is it just the part of the cloud that's being used for storage, or is the whole thing? You have to do a little analysis to figure that out.
Yeah. I think, Brent, you also asked a question about, is there a tool that you can use for assessments? There are tools that you can use for assessments. There are many of them out there. There are some free ones. There are ones, so we actually have one that's a cloud-based tool that you can use for assessments. We have clients that do that all the time, or partners that do that all the time. They are available out there. If you want specifics, we can go over a few of the options. I'd be happy to do that outside of this call.
Thank you.
Bill, are there any other?
Yep, there's some folks who are
comments?
having some issues with the, they evidently had an issue with getting the free resources link. Just if you're having an issue with that, just write to me, write to us at comply@3comply. So the word COMPLY @3comply, and I'll be happy to send you the link to those.
It is on our website.
Yeah, and the link is also on our website. So if you do comply.com and you go up to resources, you'll be able to see the same thing.
Any other questions for us today?
I know that Cruise Systems was the one that asked about the some devices that access the cloud. I think we answered that, but if you do want to reach out to us as well, we go over your specific circumstances and make sure we're speaking the same language. It's sometimes hard to interpret in a text chat. So happy to talk to you if you have a specific use case that we want to kind of dig deeper into.
I know we're at the bottom of the hour, so I think Beth and Angela, you might want to tie up for us. And again, we flew by these slides, but we do thank you all ourselves, and we thank Beth and Angela for your help and support.
And the same goes to you, Jan, and to Bill and Rich. Thank you all. Your information that you have shared has been invaluable. And I want to thank all of our attendees today and for yesterday and the day before for taking part in this webinar event. CMMC is something that is not going away anytime soon. So the more we know about it right now is, better to be, in the front end of things than behind the 8 ball. So again, if anyone has any questions after the recording of this event, you can contact myself, you can contact Ange, you can contact Bill, Jan, and Rich. All of their information is herein. Contact your local Apex if you have any further questions regarding government contracting as a whole. And again, we look forward to seeing you at our future events, and